We are back once again, my friends. Yes, back once again with another Johnnie Torch Live edition of the Johnnie Torch Program. We're not going to do a Torch News Roundup this Saturday because I did one on Wednesday. I had serious doubts whether I should have done it too, because if you've heard that broadcast, I had a terrible allergy attack. It was driving me nuts. And yet I soldiered on. As they say, the show must go on. And maybe against my better judgment, I left it up. And so if you want to know any of the news this week, you'll have to check that out. I'll probably put a card up there later. The news that just broke this past week of J.J. Abrams taking over directorial duties for Episode 9. Not going to go into it all again here, so check out the Torch News Roundup number 58, I believe it is. And there's a little more news that has come out since Wednesday. Not enough really to justify me doing a whole broadcast around. So I don't know if this special edition here very long without a Torch News Roundup portion, but we're going to do something a little different tonight. We're going to do another top 10 list. I hear those are popular. My previous one did pretty good. The top 10 favorite screen villains. But first, before we get into that, I'm starting a little early as usual. I just turn on the camera whenever I want and just start going. But let's do some channel update stuff. Get some channel update stuff out of the way. I lost another subscriber. Hey! Congratulations to me, down to 64 again. Well, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know. I've seen a lot of other channels just thrive and grow within 5 months. I don't know what I'm doing differently than them. Unfortunately, haven't been able to grow the channel the way I wanted, to the level that everybody else has that has started after I started. Another thing that I wanted to talk about is the YouTube video editor is going away in a couple of days, and that is probably going to put a serious crimp in my video making abilities. I suppose I'm still going to be able to do these live shows, and since I've, for all intents and purposes, have given up doing scripted Torch News roundups, that probably won't change the complexion of these live shows anyway. But unfortunately, especially with the horror reviews coming up next month, I only know how to create videos from the YouTube editor. That's the way I've always done them. So I'm going to have to figure out how I'm going to do scripted videos and reviews editor. I don't know how I'm going to do that. That might take a lot of time as I learn how to do from another source. So just bear that in mind if I only do these live videos in the foreseeable future. I hope I can get those horror reviews out because I look forward all year to doing them. I suppose I could do them live and just not use images as much as in a review. Don't know how it's going to work out. Anyhow, that's disappointing to me. Once again, we're starting the show on a very depressing note. I don't know what to tell you. But some of these things are, going to be troublesome for me. I don't know exactly how we're going to work through it, but eventually I'm sure we will. After all, my way into learning how to use the YouTube editor, I'm sure I'll be able to figure something else out. But it'll probably take time, and I haven't even begun learning how to use another system yet. I edit the audio on Windows Movie Maker Live. I've been able to figure out how to separate the vocal track and the image. I I I have created the opening theme on that, and I honestly don't remember how I did it, but that's a little bit different, I think, because that's just a musical piece. I put the image over it. It's not really that difficult to do, but in the case of something like this, where I'm going to have to do a whole production, I don't know how to do it, and it's going to take me some time to learn. Okay, was there another order of business? I think there was. Let's see. We have the poll of the week question. It went over very well, I might add. 19 votes. That's about a little less than I got the week before. We had the four choices for you in the question being, which of the remaining movies are you most interested in? We had the choices between Justice League, Thor Ragnarok, The Last Jedi, and Wake Me for Infinity War. Well, in third place, there's a tie. Thor Ragnarok tied with Wake Me for Infinity War. Thor Ragnarok originally started pretty strong, but it fell quickly to a tying third place with Infinity War. In second place, Thor Ragnarok and Infinity War both had 16% of the vote. In second place, with 26% of the vote, The Last Jedi. So, in first place, with 42% of the vote, with a pretty overwhelming response, Justice League. Everybody's excited about that Justice League, boy, I'll tell you, by gum. Yeah, I'm excited about it too. I mean, I don't really know what I would have picked here. I'm really excited about Justice League. I'm optimistic. Really like Batman v Superman all that much. Outright hated Man of Steel, but I liked Wonder Woman and I liked Suicide Squad. So the last two movies have seemed to improve in the DCEU. Hopefully that carries over to Justice League. Also, there's a lot of unanswered questions we're going to find out, like Superman Lives, to quote a famous movie title that never happened. And of course, see where Wonder Woman picks up from the previous film, where Batman picks up. The introduction of all the characters, Aquaman, Flash, and Cyborg, they look like they're going to be a lot of fun. So, yeah, I don't have a problem with the results here. Okay, so let's take a look at this week's poll of the week question. This week it is, what comic book TV show are you most looking forward to for the coming season, part 2? Now, 2 weeks ago we did all the CW shows, all the CW DC shows. This week we're going to do a mix of some of the other stations that are broadcasting comic book entertainment. All right, we have on the list Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. coming back for its fifth season, I believe, fifth. Gotham coming back for its fourth. Inhumans, which will be I think it'll be early season, and then mid-season it changes over to Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., so I don't think there's too many episodes in that. And the upcoming Fox's The Gifted, which is set in the X-Men universe, may or may not have anything to do with the Fox movie X-Men, probably won't have anything to do with them. But I don't know, this one seems interesting to me, but I don't know how far you can get with, you know, B-list X-Men. This is basically just a no-name family that's got mutant children, and I'm pretty sure Blink is going to be in it, and one or two other X-Men. I can't remember exactly who. But so it might be interesting. I don't know. I'm going to cover all these shows, or at least I'm going to try during our live broadcasts upcoming, probably starting. When does Inhumans start? Isn't that next week? No, that's the week after. I think it's the 29th of September, if I remember correctly. All right, just to give you a brief glimpse of what the poll stands at as of now, before I started broadcasting, I put the poll up, and in, suppose you could say, with 25% of the vote, Gotham is in second place, and resounding first place with 75%, the Inhumans. So, despite getting savaged by critics and having terrible reviews, Inhumans is still pretty popular. This is among 4 votes already. Uh, it looks like people are looking forward to Inhumans. I probably would say I'm looking forward to Inhumans the most. Like I said, The Gifted, I don't know how far that's going to pan out. Gotham, I pretty much know I'm going to get there. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. It was great last season. I really loved it. It improved over the previous season. And I'm probably would say Inhumans is the most interesting concept that we haven't seen yet. It probably gets my vote as well. All right, so we got that taken care of. That's out of the way. Now let's take a look at. It's technically 7 o'clock now. This is when I said we were going to start. So just trying to, make sure that we start the action actual program. I was going to. We had a viewer for a split second there. For a split second, they changed their mind. Okay. As usual, I got the chat up, but I can't make any promises because once I get on one of these top 10 rolls, I don't look at the chat anymore. So, don't get discouraged like I've been. But I'll see your comments at the end of the show. Okay, so here we begin the top 10 favorite comic books, TV shows, live action. That's important to remember here because I didn't think it fair to mix in the animated shows with the live action shows because in most cases the animated shows are better. It's just the way it is because they can get more close to the comic that way. But we're just going to do live action and we'll probably do an animated version some other time in the future. Okay, so top 10 favorite comic book shows live action as chosen by Johnny Torch. Okay, let's take a look here in 10th place. Some of these might surprise you because I don't think they're tremendously popular among people. Although it's interesting because the superhero television show boom pretty much only started in the past 5 years. Well, yeah, I'd say about 5 years. I mean, you could say Smallville kind of started it, but they didn't really have any spin-offs or anything. It was the Arrow era that really started the superhero show. Okay, so starting off with number 10. Okay, number 10, we have Legends of Tomorrow. Yes, Legends of Tomorrow. It was tough to pick because, well, without spoiling it, this is the only modern show that made my top 10 list. It was between this and The Flash, and I think Legends edges it a little bit, even though The Flash is, of course, a bigger hero. It's easier to get behind him. And of course, The Flash is a great show. I wish I could have found room for it here, but Legends really seems to be unabashedly comic booky, at least in the past season. The first season was only so-so, and the last, I don't know if you want to say half or quarter of the season of the first season was actually pretty good. So yeah, it's got an interesting cast of characters, and things are always moving around. I loved Rip as the captain. Now Sarah's the captain. You have Heat Wave is just a riot in every scene he's in. I like Citizen Steel and the Atom. Cool stuff going on. Some of the downside of the show is that there's not enough budget for special effects, so you have the obligatory Firestorm can't uh, power up too often, can't really shrink every episode. So there's some difficulties there in maintaining some of the comic booky flavor, but they make up for it with some pretty interesting concepts. I mean, they did the Legion of Doom when probably nobody else would. Nobody else would have dreamed it. Uh, they had some consistently entertaining villains in the past season using Eobard Thawne, who is probably the best of the CW verse villains. Just remarkable actor, and Damien Dark came back, Neil McDonough, and of course John Barrowman's Merlin. So yeah, Legends of Tomorrow is going to make number 10 on my all-time favorites of the comic book genre. Okay, let's see. What do we got next? All right, for number 9, I don't know how this is going to go over too well with everyone, but The Amazing Spider-Man. Oh, yes. Back in the day, this is what we had as kids. The Amazing Spider-Man. They used to show this show after the Saturday morning cartoons, like around noon, when the cartoons were just about over. Then they would put on one or two of these movies, or they would string together some of the episodes of the TV show as if it was a 2-hour movie. They'd have 2 episodes back to back. And I always dug it. I liked Nicholas Hammond as Peter Parker. I thought he was great. In the day, that's pretty much, you know, he was a good representation of Spider-Man. I mean, of Peter Parker. Now, Spider-Man, that's where a lot of people probably get chafed the most is because in this incarnation, Spider-Man isn't much with the humor, doesn't make any quips. It's sort of a product of its time in that way. It was sort of created to be sort of like fit in the mold of what the popular action show was in that day. Even Stan Lee hasn't had anything positive to say about this show. I suppose this is why Marvel is trying to keep it dead and buried. I mean, I would love to have it released on DVD and be able to go through all the shows. I think you can see a couple of the films on YouTube still to this day. But for whatever reason, they just are refusing to put this out on DVD. Um, Characters that were in the show that was actually in the comics was, of course, J. Jonah Jameson. He was played by, let's see, Robert F. Simon. So he was pretty much, he was a pretty much accurate representation of Jameson. He was sort of cranky and cantankerous. Chip Fields played, um, I can't remember the character's name, but she was like Gloria Grant. So I mean, they try to kind of take it from '70s Spider-Man. They try to sort of match what was going on at the comics at the time. There was no Mary Jane, although there was a Julie played by Ellen Bry. So yeah, I mean, of course, they were also hampered by the special effects limitations of its time. You couldn't really do, remarkable special effects of Spider-Man swinging and climbing and stuff. They did a pretty good job showing him climb. They had him swing like on a helicopter, which was about the equivalent of what you could see Spider-Man doing, swinging in action. That's about the only thing they could do. I want to get into, well, basically all these shows. I want to get into doing retrospectives of them. This would be a great one to start with because it was a very brief series, didn't last very long. They did make good use of him climbing because that was an effect they could do. Um, but yeah, it's sort of like a neglected offering. To me, it was fun. They made use of his spider sense. They had Aunt May appeared once or twice over the course of the show. Um, yeah, I mean the villains, of course, there were no super villains, but that's another thing where it's kind of par for the course. Back in the '70s, that was just something they didn't do. Comic book shows were sort of jaded by what happened with Batman in the '60s, where you couldn't show villains anymore because then people wouldn't take you seriously, like Batman, the Batman show. So but to be honest with you, they really wouldn't have had the budget to do Spider-Man villains, because Spider-Man villains are all very high tech. You've got Doctor Octopus, the Green Goblin, and the Goblin Glider. It would have been very difficult to do that on a '70s budget anyway. Sandman, um, even the Vulture. So you had basically Spidey going up against crooks and martial arts, uh, enthusiasts, which were, also par for the course in the '70s, was big martial arts craze. All right, so anyhow, we'll move on. But yes, number 9, we've got Amazing Spider-Man. All right. Well, let's see. Number 8, Linda Carter as Wonder Woman, the Wonder Woman show from the '70s. Once again, you know, it was a time when there was not a lot of great stuff going on in the, comic book genre for television. But Wonder Woman was one of the few that transcended the limitations of television. And that was largely due, of course, to Linda Carter's casting. She really embodied Wonder Woman and brought the perfect performance of the character out. I did a video of this, a retrospective, that just covered all of it. And so I don't really think I need to go too far into it here. Of course, Lyle Wagner played the Steve Trevor role in the scenes, but obviously it's not going to work, so I guess I better just give up on it because I'm working with outdated equipment. Okay, but anyhow, yeah, Wonder Woman. It started off in the 1940s as the comic character did, and the show moved to, I believe it was CBS after the first season from ABC. And the show then was turned into modern day. Lyle Wagner playing the son of Steve Trevor, the original Steve Trevor from World War II. But like I said in my retrospective, not a lot of villains, but they did try to throw a few colorful-looking characters in there. There was an alien invasion plot on more than one occasion. There was robots at different times. Very interesting creativity that they tried to bring to the show. And of course, like I said, Wonder Woman are perfectly in character. They had the costuming done perfectly. They learned from their mistakes because, of course, Kathy Lee Crosby did the original pilot that had nothing to do with the comic version, had nothing to do with the look of Wonder Woman at all, and it turned out to be, of course, very disappointing. All right, so we move on here now to that was number 8 on my list. Number 7, which I don't know if you saw it rush by briefly before, but number 7 on my favorite top 10 superhero comic book shows, The Green Hornet, starring Van Williams and the legendary Bruce Lee. Yes, this is another show that only lasted a season, didn't really get the credit it deserved. It was created by Lamont Dozier, who also created Batman 60s, and he spun this one into a more serious show. With Batman 60s, you could tell it was meant to be, sort of tongue in cheek, something a little more for the kids. Green Hornet, of course, because he was the series was created by the same showrunner, Lamont Dozier. Of course, Green Hornet crossed over with the Batman show in the 60s. But it was a little bit more the traditional incarnation of the Green Hornet. There was no spectacular bad guys. There was no jokey villains. The most would be there was an episode I think where the villains were masquerading as aliens. And that was sort of the most colorful episodes. It was a two-parter, and it was a very good show that unfortunately never got its due at the time. It gave Bruce Lee his first major role. Of course, he would go on to become a legend, but this was one of the earliest things he did. An episode where he was because he was untouchable in the martial arts. Nobody could touch him. But there was an episode where there was a martial arts gang where he was fighting, and that gave him a real challenge. I think Mako, I don't know how you pronounce his name, was the only one to give him a decent fight on the show because he just like go through everybody like, you know, going through water through a paper bag. But it was a great show, and of course Van Williams was a great actor. He just embodied the character of the Green Hornet so well, and the costuming again was top notch. It really represented the visual of the Green Hornet very well. Sometimes in the different incarnations they would show him with like a mask over his mouth, like a train robber or something from the Wild West, but they kept it here with the what has been commonly referred to as the domino mask, which I thought was a good look for him. Yeah, it was much better than that like I said, train robber mask. I'm not sure how you would um describe it, but yeah. So this show is another one that is not on DVD, and I don't know why. This is a great show that really should be seen by everyone to be appreciated. Saw it, I think, on the Encore channel. They were showing it early in the morning. And on some different local syndicated show channel because I've seen it also, I think, on some local syndicated shows. I don't know if it's MeTV or one of those, but definitely check it out if you can because it was a real great show that didn't really get its due at the time. And that is number 7, The Green Hornet. Okay, number 6, we are going to go with, let's see, Zorro, the New World Zorro. Now this is to take nothing away from the Guy Williams version. In fact, Guy Williams was so great as Zorro. I watched that show, of course, from beginning to end as well, in reruns, of course. I'm not that old. But this show was the one that was really on when I was a kid, and that's probably why I identify with it a little bit more. But they also sort of used the modern day sensibilities with Zorro in this one. They really kind of took it to a place where he was like, an old west superhero. It's technically not the old west, I suppose. I don't know if it would qualify for that kind of description, but he had his own. He had a layer. He had his own uh, transportation and tornado. It was just a great sort of updating of the legacy of Zorro. Duncan Regar was the actor playing Zorro, and Don Diego, his alter ego. Um, Originally, Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. was to play um, Don Alejandro, his father, but he ended up leaving the show after the first season in favor of um, oh, I'm blanking on the fellow's name. Henry Darrow. That's it. Yeah, and anyhow, great supporting cast as well. Here we had Patrice Camhi, I believe that's how you pronounce it. I'm not sure, who played his love interest, and it just it is so good because it's filled with all those great tropes that you don't see in the comic book genre anymore, where Zorro has to put his his crime fighting ahead of his personal issues, his personal needs. And this is something that, we saw back in the day with like Superman, at least in the first two Reeves films, the first two Reeve films. You don't really see that anymore in this day and age, but they got very firmly entrenched in that here in this show. He had to wait until his battle against the alcalde was over. Of course, there was two different alcaldes. There was uh, Michael Tylo as Alcalde Ramon and J.G. Hertzler as Alcalde de Soto. And good, I probably liked Tyler's Alcalde better, but they were both good. And it basically like a Robin Hood story where every week the alcalde would be doing something to terrorize the people, taxing them and mistreating them, whipping them in the city square, and Zorro had to show up and take care of business. Of course, there wasn't a lot of villains that were of name or noteworthy, but there was a lot of great cameos and guest stars in the show. Adam West, of course, showed up to lend his blessing on the Zorro, and Warwick Davis, a lot of wrestlers from the day, especially Jesse the Body, Roddy Piper, in a particularly good episode. He was in two, but I like the one where he was playing the villain, and Andre the Giant. So there's a lot of great uh, supporting actors here that helped out. It was the New World Zorro, if you're looking for it. It is on DVD, and I have the show all four seasons. It only lasted four seasons. The fourth season was very brief. I don't know what that was all about. It was almost like a mini series where they kind of introduced, also in those last four episodes, as like a henchman. But they introduce a story of, and I'm not going to spoil how the outcome is, but Diego's twin brother. So, Don Diego's twin brother. An interesting way to wrap up the series, although I thought it should have gone on more. It should have gone on longer. It seemed like it could have. And yeah, so great show. Once again, that is number 6, Zorro, the New World version. Okay. Number 5, we have Superboy. Yes, Superboy. Now, this was a great show and a very underrated show that passed by a lot of people's radar when it originally came out because, well, I mean, since it's been off the air, because it was embroiled in a lawsuit for the longest time. We weren't allowed to put the episodes out because it was a some kind of legal dispute between Viacom, the Salkinds, who were responsible for the show. Of course, they did the Christopher Reeve films, the first three, the first three, and eventually it found its way onto DVD, and that's where you can find it now. You could have found it on YouTube, I think, back in the day, but not too many people knew of it. Same as now, nobody really knows that they're on DVD, but because you have to go to Warner Brothers, the specialty website, special. But anyway, it was a great show because once again, it felt very in keeping with the Christopher Reeve films. However, it didn't take place in that continuity. A lot of people probably expected that it was a prequel to the Donner films, which technically it couldn't be because in the Reeve film, they say that he was in the Fortress of Solitude for 12 years, learning from Jor-El. This show takes a more traditional approach from the comics, which is he became Superboy. He became Superboy at a young age. Didn't you know become Superman until he grew into the role. So it's a little different than the film version where there was no Superboy at all. He co-starred the leading lady, the lovely Stacey Hydak. Always a treat to watch. She stood with the show the longest. She was in all four seasons. The original Superboy actor was John Hames Newton, I believe. He was only in the first season. Producers weren't too thrilled with him and decided to axe him in favor of Gerard Christopher, who was the perfect Superboy. I mean, he really took up where Christopher Reeve's version left off. Um, I think I think probably in fairness, John Newton's version was he was trying to be a little more of the modern, a little more hip. He was sort of the Tom Welling version of Clark Kent before Tom Welling's version of Clark Kent. And yes, I'm going to make a lot of Smallville comparisons with Superboy because this is the way you do a Superboy show. This is the way because in Smallville they tried desperately to get away from embracing all the attributes of the character. This show lovingly embraces them all, each and every stinking one of them. You have a lot of the comic book characters, the villains in it. Bizarro had a large supporting role off and on during the series. You had Mr. Mxyzptlk, who was played by a famous guy that I can't remember his name yet again, but great performance. He wore the same ridiculous orange costume that the cartoon character did for years. Just pitch perfect, looked like it came straight off the page. Uh, Lex Luthor, of course, as I've said before, I think um, the Lex Luthor in this show, Sherman Howard, uh, doesn't really bear any resemblance to the traditional Lex Luthor. I mean, he's a lot more crazy and zany and out of his gourd. But still, I love that performance by Sherman Howard. He was just a great manic energy that he brought to the show. It was just, something to behold. They also created a character named Darla, played by Tracy Roberts, who was sort of a precursor, really, to Mercy and maybe to an extent Harley Quinn, because she was a little more ditzy than Mercy. So she was sort of like a cross between Mercy and Harley Quinn. But the idea of giving Lex Luthor a sidekick, a female sidekick, was pretty amusing, and it worked out really well for the character because, uh, like I said, they had sort of a Joker and Harley type relationship during the show. Show lasted 4 seasons. After the first season, they moved it from Florida to. Um, no, I think they stood in Florida until the third season. Is that what it is? And the third season, they moved the characters from college to Paranormal Bureau of Investigation or something. I don't remember exactly, but the fact is they were sort of the Men in Black before Men in Black existed, and they solved all kinds of mysteries that had to do with UFOs and werewolves and all kinds of crazy ghoulies and long-legged beasties. But and it was an interesting choice. But the Salkinds only had the rights to Superboy, so he was never going to progress and to become Superman in this one. Unfortunately, you know, they dropped the show only because they wanted to do Lois and Clark. And for whatever reason, they thought that this show wasn't good enough, or, that Gerard Christopher shouldn't have progressed to the role of Superman, which was terrible. That was ridiculous. He should have gotten the role. But like I said, it seemed like a contained universe where, you know, Lana was only ever going to be the leading lady. Lois never shows up, of course, because he's still Superboy. But it made you feel like they were going to end the show with them two going to progress. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, the sameness of the show, that they didn't try to force all kinds of characters in. I think the first season had Perry White's son. I think it was his son or his nephew. But yeah, I'd love to do a retrospective on this show eventually one day too. I'm just spread so thin I haven't been able to. But so that is number 5, Superboy. Okay, we're going on to number 4 now. This another great show. Another great show. Only lasted 2 seasons, and I am speaking of The Human Target. Oh yes, The Human Target. This is the 2010 version, of course, because there was a Human Target version from the I want to say the early to mid 90s, that was created by the creators of the original Flash TV show of the 90s. But this one is completely different. The show from the 90s, The Human Target, was actually much closer to the concept of the character in the comics, where um, puts on high-tech, ultra-realistic masks and takes the place of a endangered person and solves the mystery or what have you. Now, understandably, that wasn't probably going to fly because you don't have the star's face shown. Have him shown in the first 10 minutes and the last 10 minutes of the show, and then some, second class actors taking over the rest of the show. I think this would have led to the show's failure, the original one, with Rick Springfield playing Christopher Chance, I might add. I'd like to do a video about that show too, because I haven't sat through that show in a long time. I don't think they've ever put that on DVD, but there probably is some kind of way to see it on YouTube or something. But anyhow, we're talking about the 2010 version, and this show was both a throwback to the glory days of action heroes on television, and it was ahead of its time. And that's where I think it ended up getting the axe. It was also on Fox, which is not a very great place to be if you're a fledgling show. You have to have success there quickly or you're toast. Mark Valley plays Christopher Chance. Love the performance. The performance is great. Jackie Earl Haley steals the show every scene he's in. He was only supposed to be in the first episode. He's just magnetic energy, and just more and more of them. And they put him as a regular in the show. And it was just heartbreaking when the show didn't last. Chi McBride, of course, played Laverne. Yes. Uh, and it was a great trio of the three of them that had just like this great chemistry all around, all three of them. And what ended up happening is the show was great. It had this great action feel. It felt like the A Team. It felt like Knight Rider. It felt like those shows from the 80s that I grew up with as a kid. But that was the problem. In SJW times, you can't have that masculine of a show. You can't have that macho of a show. And that's what it was. It appealed to the macho, the alpha male, so to speak. So the second season, they tentatively brought it back, and what they did was they gave them a female boss, Mrs. Poochie, and they had a teenage female sidekick that was sort of an understudy of Jackie Earl Haley's character of Guerrero. And eventually, what happened is people sort of just moved on, I think, mostly because of that. And I still love the show, but it's true that they were trying to make the show something that it wasn't. They were trying to make it more conventional and having them, answer to a boss. And they completely, excuse me for a second, they completely abandoned the storylines of the first season. The first season was about how Chance's original boss was after him, and he lived in fear, kind of, that he was a target himself, even though he put himself on the line for others. Completely abandoned in the second season. Very disappointing. There was a storyline with Agent Barnes, which was sort of his, for lack of a better example, Marion Ravenwood, that never really was able to get off the ground because the second season they wrote her out. Lenny James had a great role in this show as Baptiste. I loved his performance. I wish he would get another high-profile role like that, but he was like an enemy, a former friend that turned enemy, and you kind of felt for him though because he seemed like if it was a different situation, he'd be an all-around nice guy, but he was put in a situation where he has to take up the slack of being what Chance used to be. And so, like I said, great show, and there was a great air of mystery about it, especially the first season where you didn't really know what was going on in their backstories. The final episode, which was my favorite, probably my favorite, uh, talked about how they got into the business, how they met, Winston and Chance, of course. The great $6 Million Man actor, which I'm blanking on his name. He was also a guest star on that episode. But as I said, a great action show, and it is technically a comic book show because The Human Target, of course, was a comic book. This is probably the second most heartbreaking, maybe the third. No, I'd say this is the second. This was even more the second most heartbreaking I've ever had to deal with in a show, losing a show like this because it was just so great, and uh, it just broke my heart when it went off the air. And there was so much untapped potential, so much of the story not being told that should have been told. But let's move on, and we will go to number 3. That was number 4, The Human Target 2010. Here we are now at number 3, and of course, the top 3. You have to have this one in the top 3. I don't care who you are. Batman 60s. Yes, 60s Batman, whichever way you want to say it. On my top favorite TV shows. Like everyone will tell you, it's just, it's the first thing probably I saw as a kid of Batman. I mean, Adam West just took the role, made it his own. Um, Burt Ward as Robin the Boy Wonder. It just came straight off the page from the 50s comics, the 50s incarnation, the 60s. The villains, Burgess Meredith as the Penguin, Frank Gorshin as the Riddler, Julie Newmar as Catwoman. I could go on and on. Cesar Romero as the Joker. They, in one way or another, imprinted themselves on the characters as well. I mean, particularly the Riddler, I think, was not even a top tier villain for Batman until Frank Gorshin took him over. Mr. Freeze was created basically on the show. In the comics, he was known as Mr. Zero, and he was sort of a throwaway villain. They didn't even, I don't think they even intended to bring him back. He was just cured at the end of the first episode he was in, and then he was out. They made him one of his most formidable villains, Batman. Um, Once again, the music, the atmosphere, the ambiance of the pow, biff, bam special effects. It just, it lent itself to such a great, colorful experience. And like everybody says, it was the first thing you saw as when you were a kid of Batman, and you took it seriously. You took it for real. You didn't take it that this was supposed to be some kind of punchy, campy version. You took it for real that, Batman was always prepared. And that really hasn't changed today. That's where you get this Batman is 3 steps ahead of everybody else, 10 steps ahead of you, and 3 steps ahead of himself. I mean, it's that's the way Batman is. So you expected in the 60s, Batman had shark repellent. He had shark repellent. He was that prepared. He knew that someday he would meet a robot shark, and he had bat shark repellent in his utility belt. It was just the obvious thing. Of course, they introduced Batgirl in the third season, which was also great. Yvonne Craig. She was great as Batgirl. Would have loved to see the show last a little longer. If I remember correctly, the show was going to be picked up again, but the sets were demolished. And so I think ABC, who was going to pick up the show, didn't want to pay to rebuild the sets. And so that's why the show was not continued on another network after 3 seasons. Very sad that it ended that way when there probably was a lot more they could have done, especially bringing in more new villains. I mean, they in the 60s we had Poison Ivy. Two-Face, of course, went back further than that. They could have done more, but it just wasn't meant to be, I guess. Okay, so now we are going on to number 2. Can you imagine what are the top 2? Top 2 of my favorite top 10 all-time favorite comic book shows, live action. Number 2, of course, The Incredible Hulk. Yes, The Incredible Hulk, my all-time favorite character, all-time favorite superhero, with Bill Bixby and Lou Ferrigno, the great Bill Bixby and Lou Ferrigno. Bill Bixby is greatly responsible for the success of The Incredible Hulk, both today and the show. You can't take anything away from the man. He was just the supreme actor. And this was played very much like a drama, which it should be. And that's why you needed someone with the gravitas of a Bill Bixby who could cry, who could emote. You just felt for him in every situation. If he was happy, you felt happy for him and overjoyed at his success. He was going to be cured. If he had a setback, you just cried with him and you just felt the pain. His wife dying and then his other wife dying and the life that he had that was lonely, the Lonely Man theme by Joseph Harnell, just haunting and really brought home that whole you know sensation of what it was like to be Dr. David Banner. And of course you had that opening narration by the guy that played Lurch, as a matter of fact. It was a great way to set the stage every week for his adventures. You start with that great opening and you end with a Lonely Man theme. Lou Ferrigno, again, of course, brought a lot of humanity to the Hulk without saying a word. We'll get to that in a second, but he just had this great humanity that he it spoke to children. When you watch the show, you weren't really ever afraid of the Hulk. At least I wasn't. I never had that reaction because I know I've heard of some people that, oh, when I saw the Hulk, I used to run and hide and this and that. But I never was afraid of the Hulk as a child, and I watched the Hulk when I was 3 or 4 years old. Probably it is the first superhero show I ever watched. I would say Batman's up there, but I have memories. The earliest memories I have are of watching the Hulk. So, and I was never afraid of him. I mean, you always got the sense that he cared for the woodland animals and he cared for the babies that cried when they saw him and this and that. He was only, mean to the people that were angry. He was only angry at the people who were mean to him and caused him harm and caused David Banner harm. Of course, some of the some of the series detractors will say it's not enough like the series, the comic book series. It doesn't have any of the comic book characters, bar David Banner, who of course is really Bruce Banner, but in the show they changed it to David Bruce Banner instead of Robert Bruce Banner. But a couple of things on that, just briefly. They couldn't afford in 1977. You couldn't afford the Incredible Hulk picking up a tank and throwing it. You couldn't afford, him, leaping through buildings and demolishing them. You have to be realistic on what could be accomplished in the 70s. You couldn't have all that. And Johnson moved away from the comic book characters, created Jack McGee, who was a great character. Jack Colvin, of course, played him and embodied a great character there. He was the driving force, instead of General Ross, he was the driving force that kept persecuting Banner and forcing him to live this life on the run till he got his story about the Incredible Hulk. Brought a lot to the show, a lot to the show. You wouldn't have had this show, I don't think, without him. That's why he deserved to be in the credits every week, even if he wasn't in the show every week. Ken Johnson created the show. Always kind of had mixed feelings about Ken Johnson. On the one hand, he was very savvy. He knew what would work and what wouldn't work on television. He didn't. He played it straight. He didn't make there be robotic Sasquatches, and he didn't make there be aliens. And so, in a sense, he knew what sold. It was the drama of the man on the run, the lonely man. On the other hand, he's always been very, you know, to the comic book genre. Kind of didn't get it. It's kind of amazing that the show was as successful as it was, to be honest with you, with his outlook of that. But that's the reason why supposedly he chose the Hulk, because he knew it was something he could work with, and he couldn't work with, you know, characters like the Human Torch or Spider-Man, who I believe was offered to him at the time as a showrunner. And he elevated the Hulk from, at that time, C-level status to an A-level star. And of course, now I'm afraid to say the Hulk, I think, has fallen into like D-level status now. I don't think anybody really, well, maybe C-level. He's going to be in Thor Ragnarok coming up. But, sadly, I don't think the Hulk gets his due anymore. But this is the show that really put him on the map. Bill Bixby, my favorite actor of all time, did a great job in this show. Brought the Hulk back, of course. Briefly, I wanted to touch on the reunion movies, where they tried to get a little bit more closer to the comic books by having Thor as the guest star. Completely different concept of Thor. Bringing Daredevil in with Rex Smith, who I love from Street Hawk, of course, another one of my all-time favorite shows. He did a great job as Daredevil. Wish they would have spun that off. They didn't spin him off because they were expecting to spin off Thor and Daredevil. Never happened. And then the death of the Hulk, which I didn't really like, but in fairness, they were going to bring him back. Supposedly, they did have the script for Rebirth of the Hulk or Revenge of the Hulk, depending on what source you cite. She-Hulk was also supposedly going to be spun off from the show, but they never did the movie where she was supposed to be the guest star. So, uh, again, it's one of the greats, one of the all-time greats, and it really would have been my number one pick for favorite show if not for this show. And I just the Hulk is my favorite character, and Bigsby's my favorite actor, and Ferrigno's performance is amazing. That'll never change. The best all-around show, my favorite of the top 10 favorite comic book shows, has to be number one. I think you might have guessed it by now. The Flash, 1990s. Love this show. I think this show is responsible. I seen it at the right time because it was just at the point where I was starting to create my own comics. And it had a flair like no other. The closest I can describe is Batman the Animated Series. I think if Batman the Animated Series had a live version, it would be The Flash 1990 because it felt like it had that superhero flair that was way ahead of its time. This was not supposed to be allowed back in 1990. That's the reason why, like I said, you had all these shows like Spider-Man, the Hulk. You couldn't have supervillains. You couldn't have wildly fantastic storylines. Wonder Woman attempted it a little bit here and there. Took all the rules and threw them out the window. Now, to be fair, it only lasted one season, unfortunately. The first 6 episodes, I want to say, of the season, I'm not sure how many it was, 6 or 7. They did the conventional thing. It's just thugs and gangsters and bikers and all the stuff. There's always the voodoo episode because that's the closest thing you can get to some kind of colorful otherworldly magic. But they threw all the stuff out the window at the halfway point. They said, "Look, we can't have the Flash, the fastest man alive, chasing bikers." You know what I mean? The story's over in the first 10 minutes. He wakes up, brushes his teeth, has breakfast, goes out, gets the bad guy for the day, and the show's over at the 5-minute mark. And then opening and closing credits, you got 10 minutes plus a 2-minute commercial break. But this show did right by that. They brought in the trickster, Mark Hamill, one of the greatest performances, not only of Mark Hamill's career. I mean, this is a guy that gave us Luke Skywalker and the Joker. He created another great character in the trickster. I mean, you're lucky to get one good role in your career, I think, but this guy's got so many. And he was such a great catch to get as the trickster. One of the greatest villains of all time. I probably should put him in my favorite villains list, but I was doing the movies, not the TV shows, so That's why I didn't put him in that list, but he was a great character. Captain Cold, another different take, but a great take on him as a hitman. Just loved it. And the great look. Michael Champion was great as that with his little sort of snide delivery. You also had David Cassidy as Mirror Master. Always wish he had the costume though, but again, another great performance. Sam Scudder. So you got all the villain, pretty much all the villains. They didn't have Gorilla Grodd, again on a '90s budget, hard to do. But they pretty much brought in a lot of the comic characters, a lot of people for him to face. John Wesley Shipp, of course, fantastic actor. He did a great job with this, and you felt for him in a way where it goes back to the as I was talking about the human target. It's a macho thing that I don't think you'll ever see again because he wasn't always right, Barry Allen. He wasn't always. I mean, he needed help. He kind of got off on the wrong emotional foot sometimes. It just he seemed like a real character, and he seemed like a real human being as a character. And I think a lot of that is what Ship brought to the role. He brought a real humanity to him. Of course, the scripts were written perfect. They were excellent, especially like I said, the back half, great all throughout. But the back half was great. Like I said, one or two episodes were forgettable. I didn't really like the one with the voodoo. I didn't like the one with the baby. There's like that trope where you have to have the hero with the baby taking care of a baby, and then there was also slightly forgettable. But the show basically was solid all the way through. Julio Mendez, of course, Alex Desert, great supporting character. Loved him and everything he did. He was so funny. Amanda Pays, of course, as the leading lady. I have to admit, I wanted to see them get together before I knew what shipping even was. I never heard what shipping was. I didn't hear about that in the '90s, but I remember pulling for them so hard to get together, and only like the internet came about that I heard that that concept is called shipping when you're pulling very hard for two fictional characters to get together romantically. But yeah, back in the day, I was on that ship for Tina and Barry. So yeah, once again, great show. Loved it then, love it now. The Flash, and very sadly, the show was canceled after one season. They jerked it around all over the place. The Gulf War was going on, and then there was baseball games. I think the World Series was going on. That they had to keep moving it around. It didn't find its footing too well. So sadly, it never got the traction it needed. I think another main problem that they had was the show cost an unheard of $1 million an episode, and so you know, money is the root of all evil. In the case of the show, was its downfall, I think. Um, and the plans for the future, they would have made the Rogues, um, uh, the I'm trying to remember. I think it was the Trickster, Captain Cold, and Mirror Master. I think were the ones that they confirmed, the showrunners, that they were going to put them together as the Rogues in the second season. Of course, also the Trickster and Prank, I think, is a sort of, I don't know if they want to admit it, but it was sort of a prototype, I think, of the Joker and Harley. I think when they were making the Joker and Harley, they kind of got that inspiration from the Flash. But yeah, great show, great performances all around. Loved it then, love it now. Number one, The Flash, 1990. So let's look over my list once more before we get on out of here. Our top 10 favorite comic book shows in live action. Number 10, Legends of Tomorrow. Number 9, Spider-Man, 70s. Number 8, Wonder Woman. Number 7, The Green Hornet. Number 6, Zorro, the New World version. Number 5, Superboy. Number 4, Human Target, 2010 version. Number 3, 60s Batman, Hulk. And number 1, The Flash, 1990. So, once again, I am very sorry about the technical difficulties this whole show. I hope that the broadcast was, at least you could hear it, because sometimes the sound quality also doesn't pan out too well. But I'm sorry I didn't get those images up. This has always been a difficult prospect for me to get images up on the Google Hangouts. I don't know why, but it's always giving me problems. I'll see what I can do about maybe putting them in after the fact. I don't know if I can do that. They never let me before, so no promises. Okay, so thank you for watching. This is Johnny Torch Live number 17. And we'll be with you again probably Wednesday with another live show, because by then I probably will be ready to do another Torch News Roundup. Make sure you let me know in the comments below what your top 10 favorite comic book live action shows of all time are. I'm sure there's a lot of variety there that you could choose from to put together a nice top 10 list. I thought there was enough now. Some of these are more sentimental favorites like Spider-Man and so forth, but this day there also was good. Like I said, the Flash from the CW show is also one that I would definitely put on my list at some point if it didn't kind of get crowded off. So once again, this is Johnny Torch reminding you, keep the flame burning brightly, and I'll be with you again real soon.